The moment Manny Pacquiao stepped into that packed Washington, D.C. courtroom, carrying a worn leather briefcase instead of boxing gloves, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Mahogany walls towered around him like the ropes of an unfamiliar ring. But the stakes here were infinitely higher than any championship belt. 8 Filipino families faced deportation, their American dreams hanging by a thread. Camera flashes erupted from the media section as journalists leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of a boxing legend turned lawyer, skepticism written across their faces like tomorrow's headlines. The gallery overflowed with members of the Filipino community, their weathered hands clasped in prayer, their eyes fixed on the small man who had carried their nation's pride for decades. Now they needed him to fight a different kind of battle, one where his fists were useless and only his words could save them. Judge Clarence sat elevated on the bench like a mountain carved from stone, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fluorescent courtroom lights. The prosecution table bristled with 3 government attorneys in tailored suits, their expensive briefcases arranged like artillery, their confidence palpable as they exchanged knowing glances. Pacquiao stood alone at the defense table, his navy suit slightly ill-fitting on his fighter's frame, yellow legal pads covered in his handwriting scattered before him like battle plans. Behind him, 8 Filipino overseas workers sat rigid with fear, their calloused hands gripping armrests, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion of people who had worked every day of their lives, only to face this moment of judgment. The court clerk's voice rang out announcing the case, and the rustling of papers filled the solemn space like whispered prophecies. Pacquiao rose slowly, his movements carrying the same deliberate grace that had made him a champion in 8 different weight divisions across 2 decades. He approached the bench, and for a fleeting second his reflection caught in the polished floor, a poor boy from General Santos City standing in the highest court of the most powerful nation on earth. Every eye in that courtroom watched him, some with hope, others with curiosity, and at least one with barely concealed contempt. This was the moment that would define whether his years of sacrifice meant anything beyond the ring. May your hand write in steady prose. The courtroom dissolved into memory like watercolor bleeding across canvas, pulling Pacquiao back 3 decades to a night that shaped everything he would become. The makeshift home in General Santos City barely deserved the name. Corrugated tin sheets held together by hope and rusted nails, walls that trembled when tropical rains hammered the impoverished neighborhood where dreams went to die. Young Manny sat cross-legged on the cracked concrete floor, his small frame hunched over a borrowed law book, so worn its spine had surrendered years ago, pages yellowed and fragrant with the must of knowledge passed between desperate hands. A single candle flickered beside him, casting dancing shadows that transformed his concentration into something almost holy, illuminating words like justice and advocacy that seemed impossibly distant from his reality. Outside, the sounds of their barrio filtered through the thin walls, neighbors arguing over unpaid debts, children crying from hunger, the ever-present chorus of poverty that sang the same song in every corner of the Philippines. His stomach growled with a familiar emptiness, but he ignored it, his calloused finger tracing sentences about constitutional rights as if touching something sacred. This was his secret rebellion against a world that had already decided his worth. His mother knelt in the corner on a woven mat, her lips moving in silent prayer, rosary beads sliding through fingers that had washed other people's clothes for decades until the skin cracked and bled. She never told him to stop reading, never questioned why a boy destined for manual labor filled his head with words that wouldn't put rice on the table. Her faith existed in a realm beyond logic. She believed God had marked her son for something extraordinary, even when extraordinary seemed like a cruel joke told by a universe that kept them perpetually hungry. The candle wax dripped slowly, marking time like tears, each drop bringing them closer to darkness when he would have to stop reading and face another morning of selling bread on the streets. Yet in those stolen hours between exhaustion and dawn, young Manny discovered a truth that would sustain him through every brutal fight ahead. Knowledge was the only possession that poverty could never steal from you. Years later, between punishing training sessions that left his body screaming for mercy, he would return to those books with the same hungry determination. He studied Philippine law while icing swollen hands, memorized international statutes while recovering from concussions that made words swim across pages like fish beneath water. His trainers thought him crazy, his promoters worried. It distracted from fighting, but Pacquiao understood what they could not, that true champions fight for something larger than themselves. Every law degree exam he passed felt like winning another title, except these victories belonged to the people he came from, the voiceless masses who needed someone to speak their language in rooms where power lived. That candlelit boy never disappeared. He simply grew into a man who refused to forget where light first found him in the darkness. The courtroom's harsh fluorescent light snapped Pacquiao back to the present moment. Thomas's condescending laughter still echoing off the wood-paneled walls like a boxer's taunt across the ring. But something shifted in Manny's posture, not defensiveness, not anger, but the calm certainty of a man who had already survived challenges this judge could never comprehend. He straightened his shoulders, letting the silence stretch until every eye in the courtroom fixed on him with renewed attention, transforming mockery's aftermath into opportunity's threshold. His voice emerged steady, stripped of ego, carrying the weight of truth that needs no embellishment to land with devastating impact. Your Honor, between 1999 and 2014, I spent 15 years studying Philippine and international law between training sessions that began before sunrise and ended long after. Darkness claimed Manila's streets. The words fell like jabs, precise, measured, building towards something undeniable that would shift the entire fight's momentum. He moved toward the bench with a boxer's economy of motion. Nothing wasted, every step intentional, as if approaching an opponent who underestimated him one time too many. While preparing for Floyd Mayweather, I memorized constitutional precedents on labor rights. While recovering from my loss to Juan Manuel Marquez, I completed coursework on international migration treaties that govern bilateral agreements like the one we're discussing today. The specificity silenced the gallery's residual laughter, transforming skepticism into something approaching respect, or perhaps shame, for their complicity in Thomas's dismissiveness. Pacquiao's hands, scarred from 10,000 rounds of combat, gestured with surprising grace as he continued explaining how education carved its own path through dedication rather than privilege. I earned my degree not in spite of fighting world champions, Your Honor, but because fighting taught me that excellence demands sacrifice regardless of the arena where you choose to stand. His Filipino accent carried no apology, each syllable a declaration that brilliance speaks every language and recognizes no single road toward legitimacy. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his smirk finally fading like a sunset, surrendering to night's inevitable arrival, replaced by something harder to name. Curiosity, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he had catastrophically misjudged the man standing before him. Pacquiao pressed forward, sensing the shift like a fighter recognizing the exact moment an opponent's confidence. Cracks beneath pressure's relentless accumulation. The courtroom seemed to contract around Pacquiao's words, drawing everyone into the intimate space between dismissal and revelation, where truth reconstructs reality one careful sentence at a time. He reached into his worn leather briefcase, extracting a stack of documents that bore the creases of repeated study, the margins filled with handwritten notes in both English and Tagalog. evidence of sleepless nights when most champions celebrated victories with champagne rather than case law. Your Honor, I reference the decision in Takahashi versus Fish and Game Commission, decided in 1952, a case you yourself cited in your 18th year on this bench when arguing for equal protection under circumstances remarkably similar to what these 8 families now face. The precision landed like an uppercut nobody saw coming. Thomas's expression freezing mid-transformation as Pacquiao quoted not just the case, but the judge's own interpretation, turning the man's legal history into an unexpected witness for the defense. Each word Pacquiao spoke carried the weight of hours stolen from sleep, of textbooks balanced on gym equipment, of a promise made to that hungry boy in General Santos City who believed justice could be learned the same way combinations were mastered, through repetition, sacrifice, and refusal to accept that any door remains permanently closed. Thomas's fingers drummed once against the bench, then stopped. The gesture of a man confronting his own words reflected back with uncomfortable clarity, recognizing the architecture of his younger self's idealism, now weaponized by someone he had dismissed as intellectually beneath consideration. Pacquiao continued without triumphalism, his tone carrying the gentleness of someone who understood that humiliation teaches nothing, while dignity opens minds previously closed by prejudice's convenient barriers. You wrote that the 14th Amendment's promise becomes meaningless if we permit arbitrary distinctions to separate those who contribute to our nation's prosperity from the constitutional protections that should shelter all who stand on American soil, regardless of origin. The gallery sat motionless, witnesses to something unexpected unfolding, not just a legal argument, but a masterclass in how respect gets earned through preparation rather than demanded through credentials, how true authority emerges from substance rather than symbols. The silence that followed hung, suspended like dust motes in the afternoon light, streaming through the courtroom's tall windows, each person present understanding they were witnessing something profound unfold in real time. Pacquiao's voice remained steady, carrying the musical cadence of someone who learned English as a third language, yet mastered its legal complexities through sheer determination, each syllable measured with the same precision he once used to calculate distance and timing against opponents who underestimated him. He lifted a second document, this one bearing the seal of both nations, its edges worn from travel between continents, between worlds that rarely acknowledged each other's humanity in legal proceedings designed to remain deliberately abstract. What the deportation order fails to acknowledge, Your Honor, is the 1994 bilateral labor agreement between our nations, specifically Article 7, Section 3, which grants protections to workers who arrived under legitimate cultural exchange provisions. The words landed with accumulating force, building towards something Thomas could no longer ignore, each citation another rope against the corner where assumption trapped him. Thomas leaned forward now, the smirk completely dissolved, replaced by the focused attention of someone recognizing the ground beneath certainty beginning to shift in uncomfortable ways. Pacquiao produced photographs clipped to affidavits, showing the 8 families at community centers teaching Filipino martial arts to American youth, at churches serving meals, at schools sharing cultural heritage, evidence of contribution rather than burden, of enrichment rather than exploitation. These workers fulfilled every requirement of that agreement, yet they face removal because a bureaucratic error classified them incorrectly, an error they had no power to correct, no resources to challenge until now. His hand gestured toward the gallery, where brown faces watched with held breath, their fates suspended on whether justice could transcend convenience, whether one man's preparation could outweigh institutional indifference. The documents spread across Pacquiao's table formed a mosaic of dedication, Sticky notes in 3 languages, marking passages he'd memorized during flights between Manila and training camps. Transforming dead time into education that now preserved living families. He quoted Thomas's own words again, gently, without mockery, showing how principles articulated in comfortable abstraction must apply to concrete human situations or become merely decorative philosophy serving power rather than protecting vulnerability. You wrote that. Arbitrary enforcement transforms law from shield into weapon, that equal protection means nothing if we apply it selectively based on which lives we deem worthy of constitutional consideration. The shift in Thomas's posture registered across the courtroom like barometric pressure dropping before a storm, spectators unconsciously leaning forward. As the judge's fingers drummed once against the bench before falling still, Pacquiao turned to his weathered leather briefcase, extracting a folder whose contents had traveled further than most Americans would journey in a lifetime. Documents that smelled faintly of Manila's humid archives and the determination required to navigate bureaucracies. In 2 hemispheres, he approached the bench with the same unhurried confidence he once brought to championship rounds, knowing that rushing clouds judgment, that patience transforms advantage into victory. Your Honor, what neither the prosecution nor previous counsel discovered is that this bilateral agreement wasn't merely symbolic. It included specific enforcement mechanisms that were quietly discontinued without formal termination of the treaty itself. His hands presented copies, one set in English, another in Tagalog, with certified translations attached, the dual languages themselves testifying to bridges built through effort rather than expectation. Thomas accepted the documents, with visible reluctance transforming into genuine curiosity, his eyes scanning passages that Pacquiao had highlighted in yellow marker, the informal tool somehow making the legal excavation more authentic, more real than leather-bound precedents gathering dust. The judge's reading glasses caught the afternoon light as he moved through pages, occasionally glancing up at Pacquiao as if recalibrating everything he assumed about the man standing before him, with calloused hands and encyclopedic legal knowledge. "You found this yourself," Thomas said, statement rather than question, acknowledgement seeping through judicial formality. Pacquiao nodded once, crisp as a jab. "In the National Archives in Manila, cross-referenced with State Department records here, that nobody connected because the filing systems changed 3 times since the agreement was signed, because these workers were never considered important enough for anyone to look this carefully." The words carried no bitterness, only factual weight that made their impact more devastating. Around them, the courtroom had transformed into something beyond procedure, becoming a space where one man's refusal to accept limitation was systematically dismantling assumptions about who deserves to be heard in marble halls built to intimidate the unprepared. The prosecutor shuffled papers with increasing agitation, recognizing too late that underestimation carries consequences, that homework done in boxing gyms between rounds might prove more thorough than research conducted in climate-controlled law libraries. Pacquiao returned to his table, standing beside it rather than sitting, his presence filling the room, not with aggression, but with the quiet authority of someone who earned every word through sacrifice most people couldn't fathom. The movement began as a whisper of fabric, a rustling from the gallery's 3rd row where the Filipino community sat clustered like family at a kitchen table, their collective breath held hostage by hope and history unfolding simultaneously. An elderly woman rose with the deliberate effort of age meeting purpose, her floral dress speaking of careful preparation for this day she prayed would come, her weathered hands gripping the wooden bench before her as anchors against emotion threatening to overflow. Her face was a map of decades spent working in darkness so her children might live in light. Every Line earned through sacrifice, Americans hired her to perform, then forgot to honor with basic dignity. She spoke first in Tagalog, her voice cracking like branches in wind, but refusing to break, the musical syllables carrying across the hushed courtroom with the weight of testimony no legal document could capture. "Salamat, Manny," she said, tears. Streaming freely now, "Salamat sa pagbabalik," thank you for coming back. The phrase held multiple meanings, thanking him for returning to fight this battle, for never forgetting where he came from, for being the bridge between the boy who had nothing and the families who faced losing everything. Pacquiao's head turned toward her voice with recognition so immediate and total that everyone present understood they were witnessing something rehearsed, not by lawyers, but by life itself. A connection transcending courtroom geography to touch something ancient about loyalty and memory. His eyes widened, then softened, the fighter's perpetual alertness dissolving into vulnerability that made him somehow larger rather than smaller, more human, and therefore more extraordinary. "Nanay Rosa," he said simply, the informal honorific, a term meaning mother but extended to respected elders, transforming the federal courtroom into a village where everyone knows everyone's story, everyone remembers who shared rice when there was barely enough. She continued in Tagalog, her words now flowing like monsoon rain after drought, explaining to the courtroom through tears how she used to feed young Manny from her carinderia, the humble food stall that barely sustained her own children but never turned away a hungry boy with dreams too big for his empty stomach. The translator began rendering her testimony into English, but Pacquiao raised his hand gently, asking permission to translate himself, his voice thick with emotion, held carefully in check like a boxer protecting an injury until the final round. "She says her son Miguel is one of the 8 we're fighting for today, that he sends money home to pay for her medicine, that he works 3 jobs, cleaning offices Americans leave dirty because they know someone invisible will make things clean again." He paused, swallowing hard, continuing her words and his own memory simultaneously. "She says she never expected the boy she fed would someday feed her family with justice instead of just rice, that this is proof God wastes nothing, forgets no one." Around them, even the stenographer's fingers had stilled, the court reporter openly crying, while the bailiff studied the ceiling with suspicious intensity. Everyone understanding they occupied sacred ground where past and present merged into purpose. Judge Thomas watched this exchange with his glasses now removed entirely, one hand covering his mouth as if physically holding back the assumptions that had ruled his bench for decades, witnessing how dignity flows not from institutions, but through individuals who refuse to forget where they came from, even after the world claims them. Nanay Rosa sat down slowly, supported by younger Filipinos whose own eyes reflected gratitude and pride that someone who escaped their shared poverty chose to return, not with pity, but with power earned through perseverance, not as savior, but as son, who never stopped honoring the village that raised him, with scraps transformed through determination into world championships and courtroom victories. The silence that followed her testimony was not empty, but full, packed with recognition that justice without compassion is merely procedure, that law without love for those it governs becomes tyranny wearing a gavel. Pacquiao stood motionless, letting her words settle over the courtroom like benediction, knowing that some arguments win not through legal brilliance, but through simple truth spoken by those who lived every word. Pacquiao returned to his position before the bench with the measured steps of someone carrying more than legal documents, his shoulders bearing the weight of 8 families whose futures hung suspended between deportation and dignity, between bureaucratic indifference and the justice he'd spent a lifetime learning to deliver outside the ring, where his fists first spoke for those without voices. He placed both hands on the podium, not gripping for support, but grounding himself the way he once touched canvas between rounds. gathering strength from connection to something solid, while his mind arranged thoughts honed through 15 years of studying law between left hooks and legislative sessions. "Your Honor," he began, his accent carrying the music of Tagalog beneath English words, chosen with precision that would surprise anyone who still believed excellence arrives only through traditional paths paved for the privileged. "I have won world championships in 8 different weight divisions, a record they say will never be broken, but standing here today, I understand that my hardest fight was never in the ring." His voice grew stronger, not louder but denser with conviction, earned through every mile run in darkness before dawn. Every law book cracked open when his body screamed for rest after training that would destroy ordinary men. Every moment he chose to become more than what poverty and low expectations predicted for a boy from General Santos City. Each championship represented something they said was impossible, too small, too old, too uneducated, too poor, too Filipino to compete with their champions, who had everything I lacked except hunger and heart. He continued, his eyes moving across the courtroom to meet every face in the Filipino gallery, seeing in their features his own reflection multiplied across generations, who crossed oceans seeking dignity through honest work, only to face deportation for administrative technicalities that ignored their humanity. But these 8 families taught me that titles mean nothing if I use them only for myself, that being champion carries responsibility to fight for those still climbing from the poverty I escaped, still seeking the respect I had to earn with blood and sweat because the world refused to simply grant it. He gestured toward the documents before him, evidence gathered through countless hours that could have been spent in comfort earned through fists that made promoters wealthy, choosing instead to make himself weapon for justice rather than just entertainment for crowds who cheered, then forgot the fighter when he left their screens. In the ring, I fought for my family, for my country, for proving that Filipinos belong on any world stage where excellence is measured fairly, Pacquiao said, his voice now carrying the cadence of closing arguments and final rounds simultaneously, the rhythm of someone who understands that both require saving your truth for the moment when it matters most, when judges, in robes or at ringside, must render their verdict on whether you did enough to win. But here, I fight for something bigger than records or recognition. I fight because Miguel, Carmen, Jose, and 5 others whose names deserve to be spoken in this chamber of justice work 3 jobs each, so their children can have the education I had to steal in moments between survival, so their mothers can afford medicine, so their families can believe America's promises about opportunity and dignity apply even to those who clean the offices and care for the children of people who never learn their names. His hand moved to touch the Philippine flag pin on his lapel, a gesture so subtle yet resonant that it transformed patriotism from abstract concept into tangible testimony of belonging to something larger than self, representing people who trusted him to translate their pain into legal language that power might finally hear. "This is my championship fight, Your Honor, and these families are why I never stopped training even when I left the ring, why I studied law when they said athletes should stay in their lane, why I stand here not as entertainer but as advocate, not asking for mercy but demanding justice that was always theirs by right," Pacquiao concluded, his words landing with the precision of combinations thrown by someone who spent a lifetime learning exactly where and how to strike so that even the most defended positions must acknowledge the truth of impact, the reality that some voices carry authority earned not through pedigree, but through perseverance that transforms poverty into power, struggle into strength, and one fighter's fame into a platform for the forgotten. The silence that followed Pacquiao's closing statement stretched across the courtroom like the Suspended moment between a knockout punch and the canvas meeting consciousness, every person holding breath in their lungs as if exhaling might shatter whatever transformation was occurring in the space between advocate and authority. Judge Clarence Thomas slowly removed his glasses with hands that seemed suddenly uncertain of their purpose, folding the frames with deliberate precision that suggested a man buying seconds to reconcile who he assumed stood before him with who actually commanded this chamber through earned wisdom rather than inherited privilege. His eyes, freed from the barrier of lenses, appeared somehow younger and older simultaneously, younger in their exposure of vulnerability he'd armored against throughout a career built on certainty, older in their recognition that decades on the bench hadn't prepared him for this particular lesson delivered by someone he'd dismissed as merely athlete playing dress-up in a profession Thomas considered sacred territory for the credentialed elite. The judge's jaw worked, silently, as though testing words before releasing them into permanence, his gaze moving from Pacquiao to the 8 families in the gallery to the bilateral agreement documents that rewrote his assumptions about thoroughness, competence, and who deserves the presumption of excellence in halls designed to intimidate those who arrive without and pedigree. "Mr. Pacquiao," Thomas began, his voice stripped of the condescension that had seasoned his earlier interruptions, replaced now with something approaching the reverence reserved for opposing counsel who earn respect through performance rather than reputation. "I must confess before this court and these families something that brings me no pride but considerable instruction." He paused, allowing the weight of admission to settle across a courtroom that had never witnessed this particular judge acknowledge misjudgment, his shoulders carrying visible tension between judicial authority and human fallibility that rare moments demand even the powerful reconcile. "I prejudged you before you spoke a single word in defense of these workers, made assumptions about your capabilities based entirely on your fame in a field I considered unrelated to the serious business of constitutional law, and in doing so, I violated the very principles of fair hearing and equal consideration that I have spent my career purporting to uphold. From this bench, his words fell like gavels, striking against his own certainty, each phrase a small demolition of the intellectual arrogance that had armored him against recognizing excellence, arriving through unconventional paths paved by those who refused to accept that poverty of origin must predict poverty of achievement. The courtroom remained suspended in collective astonishment as Thomas continued, his judicial bearing intact, yet somehow transformed by transparency that made authority more rather than less compelling, proving that strength grows when it admits its margins rather than pretending toward infallibility. "You have presented a case that not only meets but exceeds the standard of advocacy I expect in this court, uncovering evidence and precedent that frankly embarrasses the government's preparation. And you have done so while teaching me that wisdom and skill come from perseverance and dedication, not from pedigree or the specific institutions we attended or didn't attend." He looked directly at Pacquiao, now holding the fighter's gaze with something approaching gratitude mixed with the sting of lessons learned late, but learned thoroughly. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the deportation proceedings against these 8 families are hereby dismissed with prejudice, and that the bilateral agreement Mr. Pacquiao presented shall be entered into the record as binding precedent for similar cases moving forward." The gavel struck wood like a bell, announcing victory more meaningful than any championship. And in that percussion, the elderly Filipino woman who had stood earlier now wept openly while her neighbors embraced her, with the fierce joy of people who understand how rarely justice bends toward those without power until someone makes it bend through preparation, meeting courage at the intersection where change becomes possible. Pacquiao stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, absorbing the magnitude of what perseverance across 15 years of study between training sessions and legislative duties had delivered. Not glory for himself, but survival for 8 families whose names would never trend on social media, yet whose continued presence in America represented triumph more significant than any title belt, because it proved that one person's platform, wielded with purpose, can reconstruct the architecture of possibility for those still climbing toward dignity. Outside the courthouse, Pacquiao disappeared into a sea of Filipino faces that reflected every generation of diaspora. Grandmothers clutching rosaries beside teenagers recording history on phones, construction workers still wearing paint-stained jeans next to nurses in scrubs who'd abandoned shifts to witness this moment, all of them reaching toward the man who proved that their stories mattered in chambers designed to make them feel small. Their celebration erupted in a symphony of Tagalog gratitude and English praise, songs from the provinces mixing with laughter that carried the particular music of people who'd survived being invisible, finally seeing themselves reflected in power. And Pacquiao moved among them not as celebrity elevated above their struggle, but as family, who remembered that hunger and displacement wear the same face in General Santos City and Washington, D.C. He embraced the elderly woman whose testimony had conjured his own childhood, and in that embrace existed the entire arc of the Philippines itself. The nation that exports its most precious resource, its people, then watches them fight for dignity in foreign soil while never forgetting the home that shaped their strength into something empires must finally acknowledge. Inside the now empty courtroom, Judge Thomas sat alone in chambers with his computer screen illuminating research about Pacquiao's legislative record in the Philippine Congress, his eyes scanning bills for labor protection and educational access that revealed a consistency between the man who'd argued before him and the representative who'd spent years translating personal pain into public policy. The judge's face registered something beyond respect now, approaching the recognition that he'd witnessed not an anomaly, but a preview, that the future of advocacy and leadership would increasingly arrive through paths his generation never imagined legitimate, carried by those who refused to accept that suffering should stay silent simply because it lacked credentials from institutions built to exclude. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair that suddenly felt like costume rather than earned comfort, understanding that this afternoon had cracked something in his certainty about merit and access, about who deserves platforms and whose wisdom counts when justice hangs in balance between precedent and transformation, that demands precedent evolve or become irrelevant. The evening news carried footage of the celebration with chyrons, reducing complexity to digestible narrative. But what cameras couldn't capture was the shift occurring in thousands of Filipino homes across America, where children watched their parents watch Pacquiao and understood for the first time that their family's accent and struggle contained power rather than shame, that the journey from poverty to purpose wasn't detour from legitimacy, but the very foundation of authority that systems must recognize or reveal their own obsolescence. In Manila, the story spread through social media like wildfire through dry grass, and suddenly Pacquiao represented something beyond. Boxer or politician, he became the embodied argument that the Philippines produces not just labor for others' prosperity, but leaders who reconstruct what leadership means, who carry the dignity of their people into spaces designed to diminish them and refuse to be diminished because they remember every person who fed them when they had nothing and now feed multitudes through fights that matter more than any championship. Pacquiao stood on the courthouse steps as sunset painted Washington monuments in gold that matched the light he remembered filtering through gaps in his childhood home. and he understood that his hardest punch had never landed on an opponent, but on the lie that poverty must predict limitation, that his real knockout was proving 8 families and millions watching could see themselves in victories beyond sports, could imagine their own children arguing cases and changing laws because one fighter refused to retire from the only battle that ever mattered, making the world bend toward those it was built to break. The champion who conquered 8 divisions had delivered his greatest victory in a single courtroom, and the belt he carried home wasn't leather and gold, but the knowledge that the Philippines stood taller tonight because her son had stood tallest when it counted most, transforming not just law, but the story a nation tells itself about who has the right to demand justice, and who must keep fighting until that right becomes undeniable reality, written into precedent that will outlive any single life, but carry forward the spirit of every life that refused to stay invisible. What fight matters most when the cameras stop watching? Subscribe to witness more stories where courage rewrites what's possible.